Hello, this is Sheila Duthie, and I'm starting off a presentation called Chip Off the Old Block, which is about a group called Mesolithic Deeside, which are active in Aberdeenshire. It's a joint presentation with Irvine Ross. We're both members of Mesolithic Deeside, and for the first section, to set the scene, I'm going to hand you over to Irvine.
So, what are all these people doing standing in a ploughed field on a cold winter's day? Well, Sheila will explain all that in a moment. But first of all, I'd better explain what we mean by Mesolithic Deeside. In our case, by Deeside, we're talking about the valley of the River Dee here in northeast Scotland. The valley rises in the heart of the Cairngorm Mountains, and it flows for about 140 kilometres towards the east until it reaches the North Sea at the city of Aberdeen. Most of our work has been done in the lower 30 kilometres of the valley nearest the sea, but we know there are traces of ancient peoples as much as 110 kilometres inland. And what do we mean by Mesolithic? Well, the Mesolithic period starts about 10,500 years ago and ends about 6,000 years ago. And as you can see from this map, the outline of Britain and Europe looks a little different at that time because the sea levels were much lower. Most of the water in the northern hemisphere was frozen into ice caps and glaciers, and it was only during the Mesolithic period that it began to melt, and therefore the sea levels rose and Britain became an island. Scotland at this time was covered in woodland, except of course for the tops of the mountains or the boggy areas. And the people were mainly hunter-gatherers living in the coastal areas and in the river valleys. Hunter-gatherers, well, they were nomadic people. They moved about in search of food. They would set up camp in an area and they would gather things like hazelnuts, berries, wild mushrooms, anything else they could eat, and they would hunt for wild animals like boar, deer, and hares. And you can see them here in their camp, smoking meat to preserve it so they've got something to eat through the winter. All of their clothes were made from animal hides, so if you wanted to be warm in winter, you'd better be a good hunter. When they'd gathered everything they could in one area, they would fold up the tents, move along, maybe upstream or downstream, set up camp again, and gather more food. Now, as they didn't build houses and they didn't set up standing stones or stone circles or anything else that would last for thousands of years, they left very little mark of their passing on the countryside. So, how do we know they were there at all? Well, our project is building on the work done by the other archaeologists who've been studying these people before us. One of them was James Kenworthy, and he excavated this field at Nethermills of Crathis back in the late 1970s. And what he did was to strip off all the topsoil that had been mixed up by modern ploughing to see what he could find underneath. And he did find some features. He found pits, and he found some post holes. That's just a hole that somebody's dug in the ground so they could erect an upright post, maybe for a camp shelter. And in the pits, where people dump their rubbish, we can find charcoal. And as charcoal doesn't rot or decay, we can use a technique called radiocarbon dating to find out how long ago it was that the charcoal was put in that pit. And in this case, we're talking at least 7,000 years ago. The other thing you can find in pits is pollen. And pollen doesn't rot or decay either. And if you look at it under a microscope, you can tell which type of tree or shrub it might have come from. So we know that in this area, there was open woodland with birch and hazel, and the ground was covered in small shrubs like heather and blaeberry. The other thing that James and his team did was to sieve every last piece of soil that they dug out of the ground. And in it, of course, they found lots of stones. But not just any stones. These were stones that had been worked by humans to make tools. We call them lithics for short. And you can see here what they looked like. There was no metal at that time. People hadn't worked out how to make it. So if you wanted a sharp edge to cut anything, you had to use a sharp piece of stone. And the type of stone they used was mainly flint. And as you can see here, it's smooth and it's shiny. It's also quite brittle. So if you hit it in the right way, you can knock off an arrow flake with a very sharp cutting edge, a bit like breaking glass. And they used some big pieces of stone because they needed a blade. And they also used some very tiny pieces of stone, we call them microliths, for things like arrow points. And you can see here this arrow that was found preserved in a bog in Sweden, and it's got a very small piece of stone for the arrow point and 4 other small pieces of stone for the barbs. But in normal soil, over thousands of years, all the wooden parts will have rotted away, and the only thing left for us to find is the small pieces of stone. But if you pick them up and look at them carefully, you can see that they've been worked by human hands. Well, that's the background to our project. So now over to Sheila.
So in 2016, Caroline Wickham-Jones was commissioned to write up James Kenworthy's excavations from the 1970s. In doing this, Caroline collated all the previous research and got together with as many people as she could whom she knew had been fieldwalking in Deeside in the interim. And on the back of this, Mesolithic Deeside was set up, primarily to continue with fieldwalking and to add to the picture, to join the dots of the various researches that had been carried out previously into Mesolithic times in Deeside. But the story didn't start with Mesolithic Deeside. It actually started with a lady called Hilda Patterson, who in 1906 found what she called pygmy flints in a molehill in a property that she lived on near Banki. Her findings were totally poo-pooed by the establishment, who said that there was no Mesolithic in Scotland because the conditions were so harsh that people could not possibly have survived post-Ice Age. Well, do you know, it took her 30 years, and she kept believing them, she kept strong to her beliefs, and eventually in 1936 a paper was published in the Proceedings confirming that these were indeed flints from the Mesolithic period. We don't seem to know how anything that happened in between, although we're sure that farmers and fishermen will have been picking up flints between the 1930s and the 1970s. But in early 1970s, Dr. John Grieve, who was a biochemist, had retired to Crathis, and he walked many of the fields along the Dee, all the way from Inchmarlow right down to Mary Cooter. And he found thousands of flints, which in areas which he called flint factories, which we today would probably call scatters, but they were very, very dense scatters. And he very carefully bagged up all his finds and gave good references. And these finds are still with Aberdeen City Council collection. A gentleman called Mr. Roger Daly from Banki, he wrote up Dr. Grieve's notes, so we know exactly where and the weather conditions and all the details of his finds. So when we started field walking, we didn't have very many clear ideas, except we had a group of people who were enthusiastic about doing it. And we looked at all the previous finds and rewalked some of these fields, but also looked for new fields because we're trying to establish the boundaries of these flint factories or scatters. So when we do the field walking. It's not just a matter of landing up on the field because, well, I suppose you could under the right to roam, but 15 to 20 people at a time going into a field would draw some attention. So usually first step is to get the landowner's permission, tenant farmer's permission, and work out where to safely park and how to get a group of people safely into the field. When we're there, we all line up on the edge of the field and at about 2 metres apart. And we don't just randomly walk across the field, we follow a pattern, trying to cover as much of the field as we can. We go down, we go up, we go down, we go up, we go down, we go up. And that way, we try to get as good coverage as we can of the field. Now, we don't need very much for going out. The most expensive things are GPSs. We have a group of them and we share. So we've now got, I think we've got 5 or 6 GPSs. But people, when they get hooked, they generally buy their own. So they're not hugely expensive. We have, all we need are plastic bags, and we can go through quite a lot of these, and some Sharpies. And so that is all we need. And then we've got to get ourselves into the field, of course, which can be tricky sometimes, because sometimes it's not the easiest to get a parking place and a safe access to a field. There could be a gate, but it probably is a very dangerous part of the road. Also, we go out in lots of different weather. We have been in snow, we've been in a lot of rain, we can get very muddy. But in actual fact, one of the trickiest ground conditions, although it's good for seeing flint, is frost. Because the frost is quite hard to walk on. It means you don't sink, but it can get a bit rough. But it also means when you find something that it's a bit of a job to get it out of the ground. We'll have to, I think this person down here was using a wee pickaxe on that occasion. Anyway, we do all this, but this is why. This is why we do it. See, look at all these happy faces. The Steens, we found the Steens. And the people who join us get hooked on lithics, hooked on flint, hooked on the different colours that you can get, hooked on the different shapes. This is a big cobble down here. It's a lovely, lovely blade. And possibly that, I'm not sure if that's a core or a chunk, but it's definitely a something, as we would say when we're out. And so this is really, people get really very, very excited and actually quite competitive in that it's who can find the first flint, and then who can get a core, and who can get this. And so, but it's all done in good, in the best possible taste, as Kenny Everett would once have said. So over the 4 seasons, we've actually walked a huge area. We've walked over 50 fields, which is 233.35 hectares, which in old money, I am told, is 575 acres. Now that's a lot. And altogether, we have recorded 11,085 lithics. That gives you an idea of how blessed we are in Deeside with the presence of lithics in the ploughed land. I'm always amazed that in every field, and in every field bar one, we've always found flint lithics. So it is a very, very rich area for lithics. So when we're in the field, we find the lithics, we use our GPS, get the grid reference, and with sometimes a bit of a job in the wind and wet and very cold, open up one of these little bags, put the flint in it, and write on the outside of the bag the date, the grid reference, and the field reference. That's the other important thing. And at this point, I think I'm going to hand you back to Irvine, who will tell you what he does to make sense of this pile of bags. Over to you, Irvine.
Well, one of our lucky members gets to take all these bags of finds home, and they have the unenviable job of starting the first catalogue. And they do that by making a spreadsheet, something like this one. It has the bag number and the map coordinates for each bag, and how many lithics are in each bag, and an initial classification. And this is what comes to me. I tweak it a bit, and I give each find a unique reference number, which is made up of our code for the field, the bag number, and the year in which it was found. And I also change the map coordinates to full 6-figure references, which is necessary for the next stage in the process, where we transfer all this into a computer program called a Geographical Information System. And the program transfers all these numbers, map coordinates, into dots on this map, shown on an Ordnance Survey map backdrop. And you can see our classification of all the different types of finds shown in the different symbols. And from this we can see where the highest densities are, where they're a little more sparse, and how each type of find is scattered across the field. We try to turn this around very quickly, so if we're out at the weekend, we hope to have this up on our Facebook page by Monday or Tuesday. We think this is important because it means our field walking team have still got the memory of the day fresh in their minds, and they can spot any anomalies and we can get them corrected quickly. And it's also good for the morale of our team, where they can see what they've done for the weekend and they know everything's being recorded properly. Well, this is where we did most of our field walking during the 2020 season. We walked a few more fields further upstream, but not many. And most of our work was between the villages of Banki, which you see over here on the left, and the village of Drummock over here. Two of the fields that we walked were adjacent to a field that we walked in 2019. So now we can look at the distribution across all three fields. We have to wait until the fields are ploughed, of course, so we can't always do this in 1 year. And we can see that in East Park 1, there's a great density of finds, mostly near the river, but it tapers off as you go up the hill away from the river bank. And the same thing happens in East Park 2, also the density there is a little lower, and in East Park 3, even less dense. Now this tells us that the Mesolithic people did most of their camping and flint working activities quite close to the river bank. Now one of the problems with a field like East Park 1 is that it's very dense and our symbols on the map are stacked one on top of the other, perhaps 10 deep. And each dot only represents a bag, and some of the bags may have had 5 or 6 finds inside. So it's difficult to know what is the really dense part of this field and what might be more moderately dense. Well, we can overcome that with another bit of computer science, and we can create what's called a heat map. And this shows us the areas of maximum density. Now that's useful if we will want to go back again and perhaps collect more samples, or if we want to do some excavation, because we know where the areas are of the highest intensity of use during the Mesolithic period. Well, after we've done all our mapping and initial classifications, our finds go to our professional lithics expert, Anne Clark. Here she is on the left. With her is Heather Sabness, who did an awful lot of the initial field walking and classification work with OFARs between 2008-2012. And Anne looks at the type of material we used. Most of it's flint, some of it's chert, agate, sometimes we find quartz. And she also looks at the style of the flints, because each period in history had its own method of making tools, and an expert can tell by looking roughly what period they come from. And we've been delighted to find that some are really old, from the Upper Paleolithic, perhaps as far back as 12,500 BC, that's 14,500 years ago. We found a cluster of about a dozen at East Parks 1 again, showing this field has been used for thousands of years as campsites for various people. These are not stone tools, these are what we call a core. This is the lump of flint from which somebody will, with care, strike off a flake, which then can be used as a tool. And we find lots of these cores, and they haven't been worked out to exhaustion, and that suggests that the people at that time weren't exactly short of raw material for making stone tools, which is a bit surprising, because the nearest known source we have is at Bodham, which is about 60 kilometres away from Banki, and that's a fair walk. Now, Sheila has her own ideas about where the flint might have come from, but another possibility is that actually there was a source quite close to Aberdeen, but it's been inundated by the North Sea when sea levels rose in the Mesolithic period, and now we don't know where it is. But that's a theory and yet to be proven. We get lots of large blades, which shows that they've got fairly large sized core and not short of material from which to make their tools. And some of them have got a slight notch, which means it's easier to fix them into a piece of wood as a handle, so they could be used as knives. And some of our finds have got serrated edges, which makes them much more useful for, say, cutting wood. And these are scrapers, used for the preparation of hides, so they can be used for clothes. When the catalogue comes back from Anne, it's a bit more complicated. She adds a lot more subcategories and adds more detail to her finds. So if we look at our field in Balbridie here, this is our initial classification by our team members. And this is the classification by Anne with a lot more categories. And we can look at the spread across the field and look at where categories are clustered. So you can see there's a cluster of cores here, which indicates somebody at some point, or several people at some point, were sitting flint knapping and making stone tools around this area. We also look at the type of cores, because different periods in history used the different techniques. And you can see that most of the cores we've been picking up are what we call single platform cores, and that's shown in these pie charts scattered across the fields where we've walked. Well, this is a map of all the lithics finds around the village of Crassus, not only by Mesolithic Deeside, but also by Offars. And this field here is Nether Mills 4, which, as we said before, was excavated by James Kenworthy. When the Department of Archaeology at Aberdeen University decided to go back and re-examine this site, we gave them all the support we could. This is how the field looks from an aerial shot taken by a drone. We wanted to see what change had occurred in the 40 years since James's excavation. We decided not to take out one large area, but a whole series of small pits scattered across the field, about 2 metres by 2 metres. What we did was strip off the topsoil and then very carefully scrape away what was underneath to see if we could find any indication of man's activity in the past. What we found was lots of signs of ploughing. Modern ploughs with deep, big, powerful tractors go deeper. We found signs of earlier ploughing. We found signs of animal burrowing, but we found very little sign of any human activity. We did find a couple of old river channels which had been buried under modern soil, and in that there was organic material. So we were able to collect some samples and send them off for radiocarbon dating. We'll let you know when we get the dates back. So, not much success on this occasion, but it doesn't mean to say we won't try again somewhere else. So, back to Sheila.
Thank you, Irvine. So what do we do with all this information? First of all, it is all passed on to Aberdeenshire Historic Environment Record. And that's important, that the work that we're doing is fed into any future archaeological research. However, it's also part of the community heritage, and we've been very, very keen that we spread the message about who we are to the local community. So to this end, we first of all had an exhibition in Banki Museum, and here we have the window set up, beautifully set up, and that's because we found that one of our volunteers actually was a window dresser, so that was a huge help that day. And we also managed to have a child creep into the windows, the narrow spaces, to help set it up as well, which was very good and lucky for us. We have also set up a stall at 2 shows now. This is the first one, the Banki show in 2018, which was bucketing. It was a beautiful summer, but that particular day it was very wet. But here we have one of our volunteers is a straw artist, and here we have her making string from nettles, which is very, very popular and something that children can join in to do, and adults too. And here we have another one of our volunteers with a fish trap made from willow, which again is something that people are intrigued with. This was our first attempt at setting up a show, but we were totally unaware that we were in a competition, and we actually won Best Trade Stand, and we got a quake, so that was all a bonus. 2019, we took a stand at a Boyne Games, and it was a totally opposite day. It was very, very sunny. We managed to have a display of lithics as well, and people were able to handle lithics. We did the string, nettle string, and the fish trap. And all in all, we reckon that we talked to over 200 people that day. And we gained some new volunteers as well from that. Also, other things that we do is we have training sessions for volunteers. Here's our lithic specialist, Anne Clark, telling us all about the signs we look at in terms of what the lithics might have been used for. We also would look at also bigger things like stone tools here. And we've had a demonstration by James Dilley of flint knapping, which he demonstrated and then gave us all a shot to try to do it. Now that's wonderful what's happened there, because believe me, that is not easy to do. He makes it look easy, but it isn't. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of the kind of work that we're doing with Mesolithic Deeside. Of course, there are always plenty more questions, and the one that's close to my heart is the first one on this list, which is to see if there's a local flint source. I've always had great difficulty believing that all the flints we find in Deeside come from the Buchan Ridge. However, I have nothing to back that up, and I'm still looking for a way of proving that. So these are further questions that we have. And if you would like to come field walking with us or be added to our mailing list, you can contact Ali Cameron, and our email address is there. We also have a Facebook group, Mesolithic Deeside, and a Twitter account at MesoDeeside. And finally, we do have a website, and the details are also on this page. These are some of the people who've helped us in the past. We did have a lottery, Heritage Lottery Fund grant to set up. We have a lot of help in kind from the universities and from Aberdeenshire Council Archaeology Service. So I think that's about all that we want to say today. We could go on forever because there's a lot more information. But thank you for listening today. Bye.